Why? Why is my late mother-in-law writing me a letter? Totally shocked, I was staring at the envelope that had arrived at my house mailbox. None other than my mother-in-law sent the letter. We just finished her burial yesterday. From the start of my marriage, my mother-in-law had been absolutely gentle to me. I loved her very much. Despite our age gap, we often went out to eat together, loved shopping outings, and had gotten close like friends. Her death shocked me completely. I still struggle to really accept the reality of her being gone even after following the funeral. Getting a letter from my mother-in-law shocked me greatly during this moment of bereavement. Quickly reviewing the contents of the letter, I discovered something I never would have guessed. First, the reason I got this letter was that, upon her death, my mother-in-law asked the temple priest to bring it to me. The message told me to unlock the family's chest's secret compartment and expose the presence of a secret door. At the end of the letter, the directions for opening the secret door were thorough. It was advised to be sure one opened it alone. Looking at the time, I discovered that my mother-in-law's brother-in-law, his wife, and their kids, who she lived with, were all out at work or school. Hurriedly, I headed to my in-law's place, entered with the extra key, and followed her directions to access the secret chamber in the chest alone. I carried out it. It's free. I moaned with relief and looked inside. I am Nancy. Being 35, I work from home as a web designer. 5 years ago, I went home, 4 years older than I am. We were acquainted by a friend, and as a pair our bond is still really strong. We haven't yet been blessed with children though. Though both of us love children and had wanted to have them shortly after marriage, sadly we have not been able to conceive. I used to suffer greatly and occasionally get upset over not being able to have children. Still, there has always been someone who treated me respectfully despite that, my mother-in-law. Nancy, relax, less of concern. There's no hurry required. Hey, how about we change of pace by going to the new waffle shop next to the station? My mother-in-law constantly supported me and said tender, lively, kind, comforting words. I loved my mother-in-law very much. She saved me many times. The times I stressed about having children dropped over time. I still want children, but I have chosen to let things develop naturally instead of seeking out aggressive infertility treatments. My mother-in-law and I usually go shopping or dining out together when my husband Tom travels regularly for business. Despite our different ages, we developed a close relationship like those of friends. Living nearby, my mother-in-law housed the family of my brother-in-law, who had 3 children. My brother-in-law and his wife routinely flung obscenities at my husband and me for being childless, although my mother-in-law seemed to get along with them. Nancy, you still have no children yet. 3 gorgeous children live with us here. It is unofficial to be childless. Soon cut relations with your mother-in-law. Amy, the wife of my brother-in-law, looked smug and said such things. Jason, my brother-in-law, participated in jeers of mockery of us. Amy's correct. Still, Tom has never been particularly outstanding. Even with children, their value would not be significant. At first, my husband and I would respond angrily against such offensive comments from the family of my brother-in-law. But since they never listened, we started to distance ourselves from them and stop interacting with them progressively. Though they behaved unnaturally pleasant in front of my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law and his wife treated my husband and me with such a contempt. My mother-in-law so lacked awareness of their actual nature. We wanted to avoid unnecessarily worrying her, hence we said nothing to her regarding the behavior of my brother-in-law and his wife. My mother-in-law, husband, and I had one holiday scheduled for a dinner together. The scheduled hour came, and we went to my in-laws' residence. Unlike usual, though, my mother-in-law wasn't waiting outside the door early than scheduled. Is she still not done getting ready? I spoke aloud. It's not typical. My husband answered, well, she should be coming out soon. My husband and I gave it little thought and waited for my mother-in-law to show up. Still not showing up or answering her phone, though, 5 minutes later than 10. I wonder what's going on with your mom. I started to get nervous, then more so. We rang the house doorbell of my in-laws without getting any answer. We resolved to enter using the spare key. "Hey, Mom," my husband yelled as he removed his shoes at the door. But inside there was no answer. Feeling terrible, we quickly looked for my mother-in-law. Her collapsed in her bedroom came next. "Oh my God," I yelled as I hurried to be by her side, and my husband called for an ambulance right away. Apart from my mother-in-law, the family of my brother-in-law must have gone out together since nobody else was in the house. After the ambulance showed there in roughly 8 minutes, my mother-in-law was hurried to the hospital. She sadly passed away there, though. It was an infirmity. The untimely death of my mother-in-law was intolerable to my husband and me. We felt as though we would never stop crying so much. Still, there was a lot to accomplish, including funeral planning. We couldn't live depressed and hopelessly indefinitely. The funeral was determined to be a family affair, and my brother-in-law took up the responsibility of the principal mourner to appropriately honor my mother-in-law. My husband and I worked with my brother-in-law, planning for her sake. Still, my brother-in-law was clearly reluctant even during the plans with relatives and conversations with the funeral house. He fulfilled his responsibilities as the primary mourner at the wake and funeral, even though he showed no symptoms of bereavement for the death of my mother-in-law. After a little conversation with the relatives, he would then call my husband right away and leave, offending them, thus they would scowl at my brother-in-law. Moreover, my brother-in-law would be the first to see during the post-funeral meeting with family. He would not move even when my husband begged him to welcome the visitors. He just sat there drinking his beer. His wife was seated next to him and followed suit. My husband and I therefore went among the relatives, thanking them for their presence and remembering my mother-in-law. Maybe watching their parents just eating and drinking sets the mood, since my brother-in-law's 3 kids were engrossed in game playing. Their sporadic laughter, rocketing, and gentle nudging of one another created an environment that hardly matched a post-funeral gathering. Not one member of my brother-in-law's family seemed to be in mourning over the loss of my mother-in-law. The family seemed to pick up this attitude by itself, without even trying to speak with my brother-in-law and his wife. They just bid goodbye and shared memories with my spouse and me. The family stayed the same, even although their attitude clearly changed. They kept ordering beer after beer, talking about inheritances, making travel plans in early hours, and so on. After all the care my mother-in-law had during her lifetime, how ungrateful these folks are. I started looking contemptuously at the family of my brother-in-law. My hubby went early the following morning for some operations. Staying at my house, I planned to check the mailbox for the newspaper. Then I became aware of a letter within. From whence could it have come? Surprised to discover it was from my mother-in-law, I took the letter and checked it was directed to me. Why would my mother-in-law letter sent? I went back to the living room astonishedly to open the letter. Inside was something none of which I had anticipated. My mother-in-law apparently had instructed the temple priest to set up plans to forward this letter following her death. The letter included family lawyer contact details, directions for opening the chest and the concealed chamber, and instructions. At last there was a directive. Please make sure you open it by yourself. I repeated, tracing the letter from my mother-in-law. Her penmanship was strong and bold even if her frame was thin. I inhaled deeply and gently felt her strong handwork, which really captured her way of life. Looking at the wall-mounted clock, it showed 9:30. Right now, none of my in-laws should be at my house. That in mind, I quickly got ready to head to the family house. By now the kids would probably be at school. My brother-in-law and his wife should have departed early this morning based on the social media post by her. They were arranging an outing together this morning. They also had their kids attend classes, even though it was the day following our grandmother's burial. Using bereavement leave, they were ready to savor their day off. Assuming the post was accurate, the family house should be empty. I knew I might not get another shot if I missed today. I walked gently into my parents-in-law's house, opening the front door with the extra key. That my normally smiling mother-in-law isn't here is quite sad. With aching chest, I went inside her room. Said to be the trousseau of my mother-in-law, the chest is really antique. Still, the chest opened easily whether or not my mother-in-law took regular care of it. Then I went for the secret door at the rear of the chest drawer as the letter advised. Luckily, it's open. I sighed with relief since I could open it without risk. I then investigated what within. Along with the letter's content, there was another paper. In what sense is this? Tears threatening to pour, I fixed my gaze on the papers and felt the affection of my mother-in-law. Though I felt like staying there and crying, I had to leave the residence of my parents-in-law right away. If someone came back and saw me, that would not be great. After all, my mother-in-law's letter advised me to be sure I do it alone. Following my return home with all the paperwork, I called the family attorney referenced in the letter to let them know of the death of my mother-in-law. Then I got an email just as I was ready to let my brother-in-law's family know whether we could all get together this weekend. From my sister-in-law. The email felt urgent, pushing us to get together this weekend at the residence of my parents-in-law for some crucial news. What would my sister-in-law most likely want to talk about? I couldn't get rid of some discomfort. Though I had reservations, declining sounded strange, so I agreed to consider my sister-in-law's offer. I visited my parents-in-law's place with my spouse over the weekend and nervously joined in the conversation. 3 children were nowhere to be seen, and my brother-in-law and his wife wore arrogant, nasty smiles. They had to have been grabbed elsewhere. My spouse and I arrived at our seats, and they showed a paper right away. "This is the will left by my mother-in-law," my sister-in-law said loudly. The will had my mother-in-law's signature, and its contents said that my brother-in-law and his wife would inherit all assets. See then, here it is written, "We can inherit everything, hence sadly you will not be able to receive any." Sadly, huh? My husband looked confused while my brother-in-law laughed wildly, his face twisted with ugliness. Quietly, I got up and covertly brought back the attorney standing outside. "Ah, who's this?" asked when the lawyer suddenly showed up. My brother-in-law and his wife sounded perplexed. Not knowing the lawyer had been waiting outside, my husband was equally taken aback. I said quickly, "This person is the lawyer my mother-in-law was close to during her lifetime." My brother-in-law and his wife's empty looks gradually became hostile. "Lawyer, why did you invite such someone here?" "That is directed by my mother-in-law. She wanted the attorney to act as a mediator so the agreement on the estate split could be written without problems." Declaring loudly that they didn't need a lawyer, my brother-in-law and his wife. Again slamming the desk, my brother-in-law pointed with his chin at the will of my mother-in-law. "My mother left a will including this. We have no need of a lawyer." At those comments, the attorney silently lifted his hand. "Is there any question your mother penned the whole content herself?" My brother-in-law spoke out in answer to the inquiry. "That's obvious." The attorney shook his head forcefully and seemed agitated. "One cannot regard this as a will. The testator has to completely handwrite a holographic will." The attorney highlighted my mother-in-law's signature at the conclusion and the words "will" penned at the beginning. Though everything else was written, most likely from a machine, the handwriting seemed familiar. Previously somewhat boisterous, the living room went silent. Reaching out to the will in front of him, my brother-in-law tried everything, but the content stayed the same. It was just nicely printed in Gothic typeface. Wow. My spouse pointed suddenly towards my brother-in-law. Why is the back of the paper so clean? I blinked at what my husband said. Indeed, the will seems strange. The signature part has distinct handwriting from the rest. Could this be a falsified will? At the lawyer's comment, my brother-in-law and his wife shivered. What specifically are you referring to? We wouldn't act in such manner. Why are you so strained? Should it be produced, what would you say? The attorney cut in. Forgery of a will constitutes the crime of forging a private document. Hearing this, my brother-in-law and his wife started to get pale. The attorney gave the final blow even though they were furious and giving nonsensical justifications. Nancy has a notarized will, hence your will is void. What? Wide open eyes, my brother-in-law and his wife were startled. What is that? We never have heard of it. My mother-in-law's letter included mentioning hiding a notarized will behind the chest's secret door. Neither did us. My mother-in-law told us the hiding site in the prior letter. Along with useful information, the letter clarified why she notarized her will and why she informed me about it. Having prepared the will, my mother-in-law had been experiencing declining health lately and most likely believed that my brother-in-law and his wife might have tampered with it. I had thought my mother-in-law was totally ignorant of the real nature of my brother-in-law and his wife, but it seemed she had a hazy awareness of their avarice. According to the notarized paperwork, my husband and brother-in-law would split the assets evenly. What? She had ready something like this. Eyes wide open, my brother-in-law and his wife were stunned. Then the look of my brother-in-law shifted abruptly, and he yelled loudly, "Oh yes. As the eldest son, I should be Mom's beneficiary from her life insurance, right?" My brother-in-law exclaimed, looking directly at me. I answered in a chilly voice, "Besides the notarized will, your mother entrusted me with a life insurance certificate also, and the beneficiary is me." Not only was the notarized will, but also the life insurance certificate placed within the chest door. Staring closely, my brother-in-law and his wife seemed bewildered at the notarized will and the life insurance certificate. I hadn't heard about this. About this, nothing comes to me. The attorney said, changing the beneficiary of a life insurance policy doesn't necessarily need notifying the original beneficiary. The lawyer cut him off, even though my brother-in-law insisted he didn't know, slamming the table hard. Turning to me, my husband asked, when Mom entrusts such a thing to Nancy? Anxious, he said, I knew nothing about it. Grinning at my husband, I said, it was written in the letter your mother sent me. She wanted to tell you about it too, but she was concerned that your brother and his wife would start to behave suspiciously should both of us be involved. She thus turned it over to me alone. I see, given Mom and you are really close, there is no wonder. My sister-in-law burst in hysterically as my husband and I were chatting. I find this unacceptable. Why should two people who didn't even show their kids to my mother-in-law inherit her estate? This is absurdity. This just cannot be accepted. Joining in, my brother-in-law said, exactly, and redeemed his face. You unlucky bunch have no claim to Mom's estate. We were cohabiting here only for her inheritance. Dividing it equally. Try not to make me laugh. Our heritage is all ours. Shouting still, my sister-in-law added to his self-serving assertions. We have 3 children here. You should give all of her inheritance to our children for their future as pay for not giving her mother-in-law any grandchildren. We are considerably better than you since we have displayed 3 grandchildren. We have inheritance. Though the tone of my sister-in-law was sharp, I stayed cool. Your comments make no sense. Please cool off a little bit. Even more infuriated my sister-in-law seemed from my calm approach. Your cool demeanor really irritates me. Simply give us the money already. You are a useless, childless woman. She shrieked and pushed at me. My sister-in-law shoved me in the head before my husband and the attorney could stop her. Ouch! She had many big rings on her fingers, which resembled homemade brass knuckles. At the dull suffering, I screamed out automatically. Stop it! My sister-in-law tried to grab for me again in her frantic state, even as my husband and the attorney dragged her away. Give us the legacy. I'm more than you do deserve to have everything about. My 3 children are here. Her face contorted like a demon's, her eyes bloodshot. Goading her on, my brother-in-law said things like, hit her more. Furious at him, my husband phoned the cops. My spouse and the lawyer clarified the matter when the cops showed there not too long later. The cops then showed my brother-in-law and his wife away. Thanking the attorney, my husband and I agreed to send him home for today. What was meant to be a conversation about establishing an estate partition arrangement turned into a disorganizing mess. My spouse and I nodded in agreement to provide an apologetic present. My sister-in-law smacked me one other day, and my husband was quite worried about it. But he seemed relieved when I informed him the headache had totally disappeared. Given the overall turbulent flow of events, I said, it's been quite an intense time. Then my husband raised something unanticipated. Hey, Amy seems to flaunt the kids all the time. She constantly boasted, about showing Mom 3 grandchildren and her brilliance. And you find her too preoccupied with money. My sister-in-law indeed shown a strong obsession with money and had been overly advertising her children. While she has been fairly loud about the children for a while during the prior financial argument, her concern with money was definitely severe. Her look upon hitting me was horrible. You're right, indeed. It is somewhat unusual. Saying so, my husband went into a pensive quiet. What's wrong? Is there anything bothering you? I asked, not sure what my spouse was going at. Well, I'm thinking of bringing it up with my brother. Something bothers me. Having DNA tests done for their 3 children sounds like a smart idea. The way my spouse responded startled me. What DNA examinations? Indeed, I also want to suggest Amy a background check. Something doesn't quite sit with me. It simply comes from gut feeling. Although I really felt it would be pointless, in the past my husband's intuition had been spot on. Okay, let's offer it to your brother, if that's what Tom advises. Later on, when my husband informed my brother-in-law about the situation, it seemed as though he laughed and screamed at him harshly. Just because you not have children yourselves, don't doubt ours. My brother-in-law yelled something like that. But before he left, he supposedly insisted on gathering DNA testing materials from my spouse. Maybe my brother-in-law also gave some ideas on it. The DNA testing between my brother-in-law's children revealed the first clue. 2 of 3 of his kids turned out not to share his blood. Oh, I was a bit suspicious of the youngest since their face doesn't much match either of us, but I didn't expect the middle one too. My spouse stopped in his tracks. Whether or not this disclosure came about, my brother-in-law looked into her background quite extensively. The findings were appalling. My sister-in-law seems to have relationships with several guys even before she married my brother-in-law. Moreover, lately her escapades were revealed to the wives of her lovers, who were now claiming payback. Spending more time at home than my brother-in-law did, my sister-in-law carefully disguised any notices, even registered letters. Examining the specifics, the total pay was far more than what my sister-in-law saved or earned. Ultimately, my sister-in-law was driven towards grabbing my mother-in-law's inheritance for her own at all means. It was the logical development of things. But until blood was spilt, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law got into a furious fight, tossing objects and swinging blows. Neighbors phoned the police when unable to tolerate the noise. Both of them were arrested by the coming cops. Already charged for forging the will of our mother-in-law, they now had extra counts of assault. Police later looked into it and found, among other crimes, theft and harassment of rich people. Eventually, behind prison were my brother-in-law and his wife. My husband and I were somewhat disturbed about the future of the 3 children left behind. We were the closest relatives to my mother-in-law since her death. After much thought, we opted against bringing them in, even though we wanted to. My brother-in-law and his wife had fully indoctrinated the kids to the point that they referred to my husband and me as "you childless incompetencies." At 14, the eldest should be mature enough to know right from wrong. The youngest, at 7, should have some awareness of appropriate behavior. Still, each time they saw us, they grinned and spat abuse. Their attitudes stayed the same, even if their parents were in hot dispute or under investigation. It was unimaginable to hear our 14-year nephew remark we would be better off having childless idiots parent us. Such statements made us unable to muster any affection for the children or hope of growing them to be moral people. In the end, we contacted the parents of my sister-in-law and decided to cut off relationships with the kids. From then on, it seemed the youngsters themselves sensed our commitment. As our nephew said, "I'd rather live in Grandma's old shack than with the brainless, childless couple." That led us to believe that was the best path for them. For record's sake, we have not told the kids that my brother-in-law's younger 2 are not biologically linked. Whether we tell the truth or not, we leave it to the relatives of my brother-in-law and her. Using the money left by my mother-in-law as our financial source, my husband and I made the decision to go far away and start again. My husband and I felt quite at ease here, a place full of natural surroundings. Every time we pass by the little waffle business next to our house, we remember my mother-in-law and wish she could have accompanied us. I was blessed with the child I had longed for shortly following the relocation. I started to shout with astonishment and delight as the pregnancy test came out positive. When I saw the obstetrician later, the doctor verified unequivocally that I was pregnant. We embraced each other, and my husband and I started to cry happy tears. If my mother-in-law were still living, how much would she have celebrated? Besides, the entrepreneurial strategy I had been covertly working on is flowing naturally. My husband and I are enjoying happy, meaningful days while working hard for the child on the way.